Morning, everyone. Welcome to Dyslexia and Literacy, Oral Language Connections to Reading and Writing. I am Joan Mealy McCarthy, and I will be your moderator for the day. I've been working with Will Baker and the Dyslexia Foundation for several years to design these one-day conferences to bring science to practitioners, to truly make this effort a research practice, one for children who struggle with reading and literacy. My daily work is as executive director of the Summit School in Edgewater, Maryland, just outside of Annapolis. And I must tell you that my staff and I benefit all the time from the work of the foundation. I want to welcome educators and parents and sponsor schools. Typically, we would be gathered together in person in a beautiful auditorium, and we would be also live streaming all over the country. But it's a different day and time right now, and we are resilient, so we are all gathered on the grid. But we are very excited to be here and very grateful for MGH Institute to be hosting us with this virtual webinar. I hope that we have on the grid parents of children who struggle with reading, and educators and speech language pathologists, psychologists and social workers, and school administrators and medical practitioners. There is something in this conference from anyone who works with or has any connection to children who struggle with literacy. I'm so honored to see such a diversity of people here gathered just for the sole purpose of helping children. And the fact that you are here says that you understand our job is to do whatever it takes to help children become literate and to take their place in the world. And the need for us to do something is compelling, it's urgent. TDF hopes that today's experience will help each of you help children who struggle academically, even if it's one child at a time. Each year, we cover a topic that's relevant to educators and families and that is cutting edge in nature. We want our participants not only to learn something new, but to begin to think about what they know in an expanded way. That's why we present the neuroscience to set up the day, followed by the strong research that will support the practical application discussed in the afternoon. Today's conference is made possible, as I mentioned, by the Dyslexia Foundation, founded by Will Baker, a very smart, dedicated adult who has dyslexia. He founded this organization to help teachers and families help children learn how to read so they won't struggle in school the way he did. TDF is a nonprofit organization and depends upon member dues and participation in these events. Today, on behalf of Will, I would like to thank Dr. Tiffany Hogan and her research lab manager at MGH Institute, Mary Rasner, for partnering with us and hosting this conference virtually. I also want to recognize Rachel Norton, a graduate student in speech language pathology at MGH Institute, for helping with the administrative efforts for today. And I would also like to thank Lauren Jones, who's the executive assistant at the Southport School, for organizational and administrative support to make this day happen. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsors who partner with the Dyslexia Foundation so that these one-day conferences can be a reality. Now going to listen to and see executive functions, lessons learned from COVID-19, and implications for designing remote teaching and learning paradigms with Dr. Ben Powers. Dr. Powers is a researcher, practitioner, and advocate who works with students with dyslexia and ADHD. He is the headmaster at the Southport School in Southport, Connecticut, a school specifically designed to meet the needs of students with dyslexia, ADHD, and other learning differences. Dr. Powers is active in the professional research and practice community in the field of reading. He has been a volunteer leader with the International Dyslexia Association, is actively engaged with other heads of schools to meet the needs of students with learning differences, and it plays a pivotal leadership role in the Dyslexia Foundation. Dr. Powers comes to this field in a very circuitous and interesting way. After completing a BA in Russian, he studied language education, earned an executive MBA from RIT, and then fused his interest in entrepreneurship and dyslexia by completing a doctorate in business administration at GEM. His research focused on self-esteem and self-efficacy, perceptions of adolescents with LD and ADHD to understand the impact on social, emotional, and well-being. His research interests include developing collaborative, community-based, and scalable implementation models for effective literacy instruction, especially across the learning disabilities field and children with ADHD, children who are bilingual, bidialectal, and low SES communities. Needless to say, Dr. Powers is a mover and shaker in the research to practice community, and I welcome him now. Enjoy.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Joan, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Sounds great.
Great, well, good morning. And Joan, thanks for that really kind introduction. Joan, first I just want to say a huge thank you to you because each year you really think about and consider what are pressing or relevant conversations to be having about research to practice. And so for those of you who don't know, Joan orchestrates these one-day conferences for TDF and just does a fantastic job bringing together some really leading edge researchers and practitioners. And it's just an honor to be here and to share some thoughts with you about collectively what we've really seen happen in the space of executive function and virtual learning over the last 6 to 8 months. So good morning, everybody. And again, thanks for having me today. So I am going to attempt to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. All right. Okay, I think we got it. Yeah. All right. Let's see, slideshow, play from start. All right, good. Hopefully everybody can see this. So again, thanks for having me this morning. As Joan mentioned, I run an incredible school called the Southport School in Southport, Connecticut, and we work specifically with children with ADHD and dyslexia. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with you today first deserves a huge thank you from several of my colleagues at the Southport School. A couple of them are highlighted in this presentation because it's been during the time that I've been able to spend at the Southport School that I've really had a chance to develop my understanding of the executive functions and their relevance. So it's really great to be able to share some of our experience with you today. And also we're going to share some experiences that other schools and even students feedback have from the last 6 to 8 months in working in virtual environments and the role that executive functions play in that. So before I go any further, I just want to say also a huge thank you to Will Baker. So Will, as Joan and Tiffany talked about this morning, Will is the founder and president of the Dyslexia Foundation. And here is Will. He's the slightly taller gentleman with the slightly balding head to my left with Dr. Albert Galaberta. If you don't know who Dr. Galaberta is, he worked with Norm Geschwind, and so one of the most famous things related to Al is the Geschwind-Galaberta hypothesis. So Dr. Galaberta has done research in the field of dyslexia for many years, and Will had an opportunity to work with Al starting, I think, over 30 years ago. And actually, Will literally would transport brains of people who had died with dyslexia so that Al and his team of researchers at Beth Israel could dissect those brains. And of course, today we've got great imaging science, so Will does not need to travel the country with brains in his suitcase, which is probably a good thing for many reasons. But the work that Al and that Will helped support from the very beginning has really made a tremendous impact in our community. And it's an easy comment to share that we are probably at least a decade ahead of where we would otherwise be if it hadn't been for the work of Will and the Dyslexia Foundation to really pull together researchers from neuroscience, cognitive science, genetics, and education research, not just to really think about advancing the research agenda, but also, and most importantly, thinking about the end user. How can we take the relevant findings and the leading edge research that people are doing in the field and help get that in front of teachers, other practitioners, and parents and people who support our kids. So again, a huge thank you for the work of Will Baker and the Dyslexia Foundation. All right, so my job today is to do really three things. Number one, what I'd like to do is just give a quick EF overview. I know that both Lori and Vince this morning have done a terrific job of breaking down the executive functions and talking about them in more detail, especially related to the content of their talks. So I'm just going to give a quick recap of some of those things. And then the second thing I'd like to do this morning is share some thoughts about how EF might impact instruction, especially in a remote environment. So what are some of the advantages? What are some of the disadvantages in virtual learning and remote environments? And then the final thing I'd like to do is share some thoughts with you from the field. And when I say the field, these come from some different schools, different practitioners, and again, even some students who have shared comments about what the experience has been like in the virtual space. So we're going to share some strategies and key lessons. All right, so simple view of EF. So as Lori talked about this morning, we've got Hollis's rope of a simple view of reading, and really a simple way to look at the executive functions. And again, Lori and Vince covered this really well this morning, but thinking about working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. So those are really kind of the three core areas of executive when we think about the executive functions. Now, that's a really simple view. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a much more complex model of what this looks like. But here's what's important. It's great for us to hold a simple view of what these different components that contribute to executive functioning is. At the same time, a simple view is a really challenging way to look at this because it's easy to associate some of these terms like working memory or inhibitory controls with a simplistic view of what that looks like. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. But one of the biggest challenges in working with families or educators or people who aren't really aware of or that don't have a deep understanding or knowledge of some of these things, when we talk about working memory, when we meet with parents, as parents come in to look at a school like ours, a lot of parents might say something like, oh, well, no, my child has a great memory. They have a great short-term memory, a great long-term memory. So, it's as much as, a simple view is really helpful to at least understand what ingredients are contributing to the whole concept of executive function. It's really important that we dig just a bit deeper so that we understand really what are these aspects and why do they, what makes them work or contribute to how we have the ability to do all of the things under the umbrella of executive function. So I want to talk about working memory for just a second, okay? The way that I like to think about working memory is to think about RAM. Of course, when I think about RAM, this is actually the first thing I think about is literally the animal. Although when I Googled this morning to get a picture of a ram, this is actually what came up. Because of course, when you Google Ram in America, I think Ram trucks are one of the best-selling trucks in America. Didn't think about that. And of course, it's a good reminder that when we use examples or we share concepts even with our students, that just because we are clear on the word or the language we're using, it doesn't mean the end user always is, right? So, of course, these are two different versions of RAM, but I don't mean either of these. What I'm actually talking about is computer RAM. So if you think about the RAM in your computer, and anybody who's purchased or a laptop at some point in the last 5 to 10 years, one of the decisions you have to make is how much RAM is in your computer. And I think this is actually a visual of somebody who was having trouble with Photoshop. Photoshop uses a lot of RAM when it processes the ability to edit images. And this is somebody who was saying, well, geez, I don't understand what's going on. This is a challenge. My computer's Photoshop's not working, and it's a memory issue, but I've got a lot of space on my hard drive. And I think this is a really good example of why it's so important to understand something like working memory. Your computer can have a massive hard drive. You can have the big terabytes of ability to, store information. RAM is the ability, to have and manipulate that information simultaneously. And again, Lori talked about this morning. It's not about your ability to remember things. That's not what working memory is. It's your ability to have that in the space to work on it in the present and really think about and link and consider other ideas at the same time. And so you can have a huge hard drive, but if you only have a small amount of RAM, and for those of you who are aware of what RAM is, and when you provision your computer, if you didn't buy enough, you were probably kicking yourself the first time you had an application shut down. On a Mac, it's that kind of spinning wheel of death, right? Those are all RAM related issues. And so of course, on a computer, when that happens, the easiest thing to do is to just start closing some applications. And so you get to the point where you close enough applications and then you can, of course, use your computer. Well, that's a really easy thing to do on a computer, not so easy in the human brain. This is actually a really good model from Diamond. This is from a paper in 2013, that really goes into more in depth what these executive functions are and these key categories of inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So here's the other thing I'd like to point out. And so we just talked about why some of the, using some simplistic language sometimes doesn't give us the full view of the model with something like memory versus working memory. But there are also challenges in things like talking about inhibitory control. So a lot of times, in my experience working with families or even with students, when we think about inhibitory control, maybe it's the verbal, the ability to just not say the things. I think Vince said in his talk this morning, we've all been in that situation where a thought comes to mind and you might be about to articulate it, but you stop yourself because you realize it's either not the time or the place, or it's not, might not be appropriate to the context. That is absolutely one form of inhibitory control. And so I think that's a lot of things, what we think about when we think about inhibitory control. But there are also things like, thoughts and memories. So when we think about kids with executive function dysregulation, and again, there's a huge overlap with kids with ADHD, we also think about things like the impact on anxiety. And so one of the challenges for people with inhibitory controls is that they have a hard time controlling their thoughts or their memories. And so that might be pervasive. You might not actually even see this in a classroom. So it might be a kid who can actually maybe have some inhibitory control with their words or actions, but maybe not with their thoughts. And so the kid could be sitting in class or home in the virtual environment and be having a real, real challenge with inhibitory control with some of the things we can't see. So this model, and I believe we're sharing all these slide decks with everybody. And of course, these talks are they're being recorded and shared later, but hopefully this gives you, a deeper sense, and it's a good reference point for how the different executive functions, what they really mean when we're thinking about inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, and how they all kind of integrate and come together to allow us to do these higher level executive function components. When we're talking about fluid intelligence, we're talking about reasoning and problem solving, and of course, planning. So the point of this is to help understand that, we can have a simple view of the executive functions, but it's really complicated. The executive functions are really complicated. And as Lori mentioned in her talk, when we think about activities or tasks that are designed to focus on executive functions and improving executive functions and things like transfer, it's complicated, not just because we want to understand how to transfer executive functions, but also so that we have an opportunity to really think about, that it's not just one thing. It's not one task. It's not one aspect. There are myriad aspects to executive function and how they integrate, work together, and impact our lives. So because this is a TDF talk, I have some obligatory brain pictures. And I want to talk about just a few of the areas that we talk about when we're talking about the executive functions in the brain. And again, Lori did a great job highlighting some of this morning. But I want to point out too, I just like to note that I actually have a spinning brain in my talk. Now, I guess I got trumped this morning. Vince had a much cooler spinning brain from Gage's, the study on Gage, but it does spin. But the point of that spinning brain is to help show that, these parts of the brain that impact executive function, like the anterior cingulate cortex, they're these different areas of the brain. Number one, it's not just one area of the brain that's responsible for one thing. And I think, the case study with Gage, and there are other case studies about the impact on the brain, and then how the brain, and Vince talked about, the fact that our executive functions are malleable. They're not just fixed over time, they can change. And so of course there's plasticity, that's a result of, in some ways, of the brain being plastic. There's a plasticity to the brain. And so we can impact these things for good or for bad. But it's not just that it's one specific area of the brain that is responsible for one thing, that these things, again, are all interconnected. And so when we think about the anterior cingulate cortex, we're thinking about things like inhibition of responses, we're thinking about decision making, we're thinking about how things can be, we're thinking about motivating behaviors, all these different types of things. And when we look at the parts of the brain, when we're looking in the prefrontal cortex, we're thinking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or the orbital frontal cortex. Again, some of these areas are areas that do have specific connection to different areas of executive functions, but again, there's a lot of overlap. And I think when Lori was talking about the FPN this morning, the frontoparietal network, we're thinking about the dorsolateral, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is part of that, of course. And so when we're thinking about these things, we're thinking about, like I'll call it the DPC, just so I don't have to repeat that word, thinking about things like shifting or planning or response inhibition. So, and we're thinking about the orbital frontal cortex. We're thinking about things like impulse control or social appropriateness. And so, again, these different areas of the executive function all overlap. And so it's a very complex, they're very complex, and it's why so much research is being done to really help understand them. I think for our kids or our parents or for educators, one of the real benefits of this is understanding that this is a brain-based issue and it's complicated. So, it's easy to blame kids for, not wanting to learn or, being good at some things. And, we look at kids sometimes say, oh, they're a smart kid, but they're just not working hard or they're not motivated. One of the reasons it seems so important to me that we've got this great imaging work that's being done, and this, even if it's kind of a nascent understanding at this point still of the, relative to the complexity of executive function, that we understand and we can share that these are brain-based issues. So let's talk a little bit about executive function and instructional considerations. And this is actually one of the most important slides in my talk today. So if you take anything away from today's talk, please take away this. Executive functions are important for every single learner. They're important for us as adults, they're important for kids, and the executive functions change in us, as Vince talked about, again, for good or for bad. And the ability with some executive functions when kids are really little, much more challenge. I think that's kind of an innate understanding. Believe it or not, as we get older, as adults get older, there are kind of similar changes in executive functions that make us, one aspect of executive function that might change as somebody grows older is that visual stimuli can be more disruptive to them. So as somebody gets older, an older adult, they're more consumed by visual, they can be more consumed by visual stimuli, so they might get more distracted. So, it's a changing dynamic, but it's important for every single person. The executive functions are important for everybody. However, we know that they are more important for kids with executive function dysregulation or ADHD. And so there is a lot of crossover between EF and ADHD. And in fact, Eric Wilcutt did a great study, he and his colleagues, on looking at executive function and groups of ADHD students, and we know that by the nature of of ADHD, that there is a huge impact of executive function dysregulation related to ADHD, and at a group level, that in their study they noted this, but we can't, at the same time, we have to be careful. We can't just say, well, just because somebody is ADHD, they're going to have awful executive function regulation, or just because somebody has impact in areas of executive function, that means that they're ADHD. It's important to tease those two things out. But again, executive functions are important for everybody, super important. All right, so it's important regardless of student. It's also important regardless of setting. So we're here talking today about school and virtual instruction and what are those implications. But executive functions have such a huge impact on our entire lives. So we talked just about ADHD, but there are also comorbid issues, like we think about depression or OCD or addiction issues. So that those are all related to things like mental health and physical health. Of course, success in school, we think about executive function is a huge indicator of school readiness. Executive function also impacts, as we've heard this morning, certain areas, of course, of math and reading. We find that executive function really impacts things like developmental reading skills. And also there have been studies that, reference the impact on things like the sciences. But, given our understanding at this point of what the executive functions are and how they impact us as human beings, it's of course sensible that these things are going to impact a student's experience in school, the outcomes and the success of how they do in school. But they also impact the quality of life. When we think about adults with executive function dysregulation, that's going to impact adult relationships. It can impact marriages or, unions between people. It can impact a lot of different types of relationships, and certainly things like job success. So executive functions are critically important for our success in school, but we spend 13 years in primary and secondary school, and then we've got a whole runway of life ahead of us. And so the work that we do to embed and understand how we can help promote a child's understanding, a student's understanding of where their strengths and weaknesses are with the executive functions, and what we can embed in our instruction to really help leverage those strengths or help offset some of those challenges for them. This is a lifelong gift we can give kids. All right, so thinking about the role of executive functions and how this might impact instruction, this is just kind of a quick overview of what are some of the advantages or disadvantages related to being in person versus being in a virtual environment. And so we think about some of the advantages of being in person. Of course, we've got the ability to directly connect, and even today, it's much more challenging for me to give this talk. In some ways, there's an advantage that I can have my notes or things right here in front of me, and there's some control over that. The flip side is, for me, I benefit from human interaction, as a lot of people do, or reading the audience, or getting a sense of what's clicking with people or what's not clicking with people. Are people shaking their heads and not understanding, or they're nodding and saying, "Yep, got it," keep moving along. So there's a value in things like direct connection. Of course, there's a value that in-person learning is the traditional form of learning. It's something that we're comfortable with, so there might be less stress with something like that. So I'm not going to go through all of these different aspects of why things are an advantage or a challenge of being in person, but hopefully some of these resonate with you if you are working with kids either in a classroom or in some other way to support them, or if you're a parent supporting your child at home. What I would like to focus a little more on are what are some of the advantages and challenges specific to executive function in the virtual space. So one of the opportunities that we find is that because we're able to have this this space, this virtual space like Zoom, and I even see this happening this morning, a lot of people are able to ask questions. We're able to actually in schools or as adults, we're able to at some point in a meeting, you can break out and you have a virtual space maybe to break out with a small group or even a one-to-one session. So, there are some advantages that we might not have in a traditional learning environment. We might have some more flexibility. We might be able to differentiate instruction more. We might be able to focus on instruction more. I think one of the challenges in the traditional learning environment is that we've got a need to cover so much content, and content is often the driver. Whereas in a virtual space, by nature, that it's such a new paradigm, and there are challenges in the shift to virtual instruction, that we actually really have to think a lot more as educators about how are we delivering instruction. So there are a lot of opportunities to think about how these might be advantages for our students and for us as practitioners or parents. Some of the challenges in the space, one is time management. So for certain kids, who struggle with time management, the value of being in a classroom and being on a very scripted schedule and having a lot of maybe more oversight versus being in a space where it's really, in many ways, not, you've got to attend to the screen. And if the teacher doesn't notice you're not paying attention, you could be lost, or, you kind of have to develop your own structure or your own timetable at home. And if part of that is all around the ability to self-regulate. There are, of course, challenges with efficiencies. We've experienced this as adults with, what are the inefficiencies of, meetings online or not being able to connect in person. There are challenges with resources, of course. One of the huge issues that we saw transitioning to a virtual space was that so many teachers had materials and things that they had that were physical in their classroom. And of course, it's much more challenging to share those in a virtual space. And of course, part of that too and relative to the executive functions are the human resources. So in a school, there are a number of people in a school building that can help support learners, whether they're counselors or just even another teacher or a trusted person in the community that a child can go to. Whereas in a digital space, it's much more constricted. So, there are challenges with resources, and of course, there are digital environmental distractions and techno glitches. Even if it's not the technology's fault, maybe the human fault. And I think even this morning I was nervous to get this presentation up and running online. It's it's nerve-wracking in a way because it's somewhat new and it's different. So again, all of these things can impact how we think about the role executive functions might play in these virtual environments. So when we think about that, here's some feedback. This is actually from a colleague, Jeff Mitchell at Curry Ingram Academy. One of the things we asked to our colleagues was to share some of, what did they see as challenges in the space? Oh, back. And hold on, I'm just going to move this. What are some of these challenges in this space? And so Jeff Mitchell talked about some of the things we just highlighted, the ability for students to really have to be independent and to be having to plan their time, to have to do goal setting and focused attention and time on task. There's a lot of load on a student, especially if they're younger in this space. And when we think about that complex overview of all the different elements of executive function and where it's happening in the brain, there's actually a lot going on. And on top of that, of course, there are environmental concerns. It might be easier, maybe there are siblings at home, or you've got maybe the TV is right off to the side, and that's a really easy way to become distracted, or the family pet, or whatever the case might be. It might be more challenging for a student to kind of self-regulate and monitor behavior. Stress levels. We know that stress has a huge impact, or can have a huge impact, on executive functions and social emotional well-being. And so, the stress of these new environments, and of course the stress related to the coronavirus, that can be really challenging for students as well, of course, as all of us as adults. And we need to find, one of the challenges, I think we need to find new ways or more direct ways to help support executive functions in students. Let's see. Hold on a sec. Oh, there we go. So some other challenges. This is actually from a colleague of mine at the Southport School, Jeff Rogerio. Just want to say that Jeff has done just an incredible amount of work at our school to really help us understand the executive functions. I give him a lot of credit for helping me really learn a lot about the executive functions. And so when we think about some of the challenges that Jeff Rogerio shared, again, it's about applying EF skills to the different the content and strategies in these new environments. And one of the things that Jeff noted was that, for the students who we had the opportunity to work with for a longer period of time and embed language and support around the executive function, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Those students, regardless of whether they had less or more challenge with executive functions, the fact that they had less experience with us understanding them and an immediate shift into the virtual learning environment, was a huge challenge. Now, one of the huge opportunities is that, and this is this little visual that we have off to the side here. These visuals that you see here, these are in all of our classrooms at the Southport School. We have this language embedded throughout our curriculum, and it's something that we've had for several years as part of the way that we work with our kids so that everybody has shared language around the executive functions. It's one of the huge benefits of having some simple shared languages that it helps students articulate where they might be finding success or where they might be having challenges. And it also helps our teachers really help our students identify those as well. But that was actually one of the huge opportunities thinking about executive function and virtual learning, that, if you have that shared language, if you can build a kind of platform around that, regardless of whether the instruction is in person or remote, that it's easier to kind of, it's easier to help support our learners in those environments. Another important piece of this is that, and it's an advantage, as somebody asked in the last session about how to train executive functions, or should you focus on executive functions? I think that the whole switch to virtual learning, and as Jeff is sharing, that it's really demanded more focus on being mindful as educators of what the executive functions are and how they might be impacting students at home, and the increased opportunity to really focus on embedding executive function related tasks in what we're doing with the students. Another huge opportunity in thinking about the virtual environment is that we had spent time each year, offering workshops or opportunities for parents to understand the executive functions. And one thing we saw was that for those parents who had taken advantage of those and who had some understanding of the shared language and the opportunities to support executive function, they definitely had an easier time helping support their child at home. And so, it's nice to kind of validate that it actually is helpful and that it makes a difference for the other 16 hours of the day when children aren't in school. And then, really thinking about the opportunity to really differentiate by age. We know that executive functions, the dynamic changes as from birth through old age, that it is malleable and flexible, and we see certain kind of milestones of development that are in typical developing brains. And so, we understand that the executive functions really do differentiate based by age. So Jeff Mitchell, he shared some opportunities too, that, that this whole virtual learning environment, so many of our kids are tech savvy by nature. So it was an opportunity for them to be able to feel confident and successful, and that actually removes some stress, removes some anxiety. And it also gives them a different platform or different way for them to share what they've learned or share their understanding of something. In many schools, in many instances, we have to rely on assessments, that teachers give kids. And this whole digital platform provides opportunities for students to share what they've learned or their knowledge in different ways. And because of the independent nature of all this, again, this has been an opportunity in some ways to really help students spend time focusing on how they can leverage or how they can work to improve certain aspects of their executive function to find success at home. All right, so what do some of the students say? Here are some quotes from some students. Since getting more sleep, I found to be much more efficient in my schoolwork. I think, all of us, as much as we know sleep is important, our lives are busy and sometimes we don't get all the sleep we need. But for me, the nights I get a good night's sleep, I certainly can feel it in the morning that I'm more alert, more, better able to get through my day successfully. And of course, these things are supported by the research, that we know that not having enough sleep or heightened levels of stress really can negatively impact the executive functions. Another student said, one of the big takeaways is the need to relax. Again, the cognitive load on the brain for, all these different aspects of the executive functions to be successful, having a break to do something that is either enjoyable or time to get physical, whether it's a walk or exercise, all of these things can have a positive impact on executive function. So again, this is actually another opportunity in the virtual space, is finding times to give kids those breaks or give kids the opportunity to relax. And of course, if kids are virtual, they're not on the bus for 2 hours a day. The slower pace, being able to learn on their own terms. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that we've heard from students is that, and this is a common kind of challenge in the US educational system, that a lot of curriculum in the US is all about breadth rather than depth. And so the fact that, I think as educators, we had to actually cover kind of, reduce breadth, but it allowed students to go deeper. And again, all of these things help support their learning and support their executive functions. So here are some strategies and key lessons, and a huge shout out to our colleagues at the AIM Academy, Grace Ashton, and a couple other schools I'll mention in a moment. But here are some, and again, none of these things are overly complicated or overly taxing on us as educators, but they really go a long way to helping make a child or student feel less stressed and create an opportunity to reinforce what is good practice with areas of executive function, and also to provide the student with a structure or a framework or a scaffold to be successful. So here's an example Grace shared with us about posting a daily agenda and really making sure the students understand, here are all the things we're going to do today. It really helps them understand what that class is going to look like. This is something that we actually do at the Southport School as well, regardless of whether we're in the classroom or in the virtual space. Really a huge opportunity. Another opportunity Grace shared is these daily warm-ups. I'm sure a lot of teachers do these, but even in a virtual space, having these warm-ups, makes a really big impact in getting a student going, up and running, and activating those executive function skills. Another example is using Google Classroom to help students organize. This is an example that Grace shared with us from a third grade math class, where again, it's just, structured, organized, which gives students not just the ability to understand where things are and how they work, but also it's really good modeling for students in terms of thinking about how they can develop their own planning and organizing techniques with their schoolwork or with other aspects of their lives. Another tip that Grace has shared with us is that they're using Google Slides at AIM instead of Google Docs. One of the reasons is that it's really just a nice way to package content together. You can see it's much more visually appealing, but it also helps that it's much easier to organize. So the visual organization of this too is super helpful for kids, which of course supports task initiation, perseverance, organization, and structure. So all really good techniques to help support kids. My colleague at the Southport School and Southport CoLab, Sharon Plant, she does a lot of work in instructional and assistive technologies. She was kind enough to share some strategies that she's seen work in regard to leveraging the technology space and different apps. So some of the suggestions and tips that she shared, consider apps that allow you to be able to view all the student work at the same time. So things like ClassKick, Pear Deck, Nearpod. Again, because students need a lot more reinforcement or monitoring in a virtual environment, the ability to see all the student work simultaneously means you can kind of keep an eye on everybody, as best as possible. simultaneously. Another suggestion that Sharon gave was, just be mindful of how many different apps or tools you're using within a time frame. That, again, we want to be mindful about shifting and that working memory demand, and also the ability as kids are going between apps or different things that, of course, it's easy to lose focus and maybe get distracted. And of course, that's really all about the concept of sometimes less, a lot of times less is more. That, again, by reducing, by really focusing on a few key apps and materials, that we're able to really limit that distractibility or those challenges with inhibitory controls. So another opportunity to leverage the EF instruction effectively that Sharon has shared are using things like the SAMR model, SAMR. If you haven't seen this, it's a really good model. And this is really to be mindful of, is the technology tool you're using, is it a substitution for something that you'd be doing in the classroom? Is it an augmentation of that, a modification, or is it redefining how you're doing instruction? So just being mindful of, is this app, or, is it just literally that you've scanned a worksheet and you're providing it to the child, it's just a substitution? Or, again, how is the technology being used and what are you getting out of that? And what's the student getting out of that experience? Remembering the objectives and of course, remembering the objectives and the audience. How are the tools that you're using? How are they engaging kids? How are those tools effective at maybe chunking down different pieces of instruction? And how is it giving opportunity for student responses? I think one overwhelming, piece of feedback we've gotten from a lot of educators is that, the virtual platform is a time where it's less about teachers talking and more about students being engaged and responsive. And, again, the technology can be used a lot for things like differentiation. And two examples she gave were active learning and Edpuzzle, that it's the ability to give content to students where we can also embed things like questions so that we can have students, engaging the working memory and, cognitive flexibility as they're going through a task or an assignment. What are some key suggestions or key lessons? That it's really important on a social emotional side. Again, we talked about the challenge of, not having kind of that whole team of humans in place that we usually have in a physical space, finding time, and this is really tough for, again, if there's huge demands in the virtual space, but finding times even for short check-ins with either an advisor or a mentor, and maybe that's, again, leveraging all the humans that you have in your community. And being proactive about, counselor support or engagement. That's actually one of the things we've done at our school is really being more mindful about pushing in support into different classrooms and finding opportunities for the kids to engage with each other. I think this is a huge issue that we've all been faced with. The social interaction has been hugely challenged for kids. So, finding that time for them to connect is really helpful too. And, what are some other key considerations? Parent engagement, we talked about that a few minutes ago about, the value of those parents who had been trained or engaged in things like understanding the executive functions. This whole time has been a time where we've really had to rely so much more on parent engagement and support at home that whole communication channel is critical. Being mindful that our kids are by nature, given the context of what's happening in the world right now, they're likely to be more anxious. And of course, in a new virtual learning environment, there's anxiety that goes along with that as well. So as educators, are we being mindful about the content or the books or the things we're putting in front of our students? Finding ways to find opportunities for kids to be able to respond, engage, reflect on what they've learned in class. And to find ways to engage them in really that discussion piece. Again, finding ways for them to be able to demonstrate their knowledge. And for educators, it's the opportunity to really make sure that they are actively engaged and that they're being engaged in class. So what's the 411? What are our takeaways from today? Hopefully you got that. Number one, executive functions are real, they're complex, and they're absolutely brain-based. Number two, that everybody benefits from executive function support in school. Of course, for certain populations like kids with executive function dysregulation or ADHD, they require more support. It's even more important. And that this whole virtual learning environment, while there are a lot of challenges for sure, there's no doubt about that, there are also opportunities we can leverage, especially around reinforcing executive functions for our kids. And that we really need to make sure we're thinking about the considerations for curriculum instruction. There are practical considerations, whether they're different apps or pieces of technology we can leverage, or whether it's thinking, just about the book selection in a literature class and, is that book, the right book right now in this moment, given the challenges and of things like anxiety and stress levels in our kids. That again, all of these things can support virtual learners, whether they have executive function challenges or not. So hopefully this has been a helpful overview and that you've gotten some tips and some strategies to be able to help support your students in the classroom or for parents at home. Again, these will be shared with everybody, so you'll be able to see them in more detail. And again, I just want to say a huge thank you for your time and attention today. And again, a huge thank you to the Dyslexia Foundation for hosting today's event.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. Fantastic talk. I think we do have time for one question before we turn to lunch. So the question is, rather than not thinking it is brain-based, I hear district teams claiming that because it's brain-based, there's no sense in trying these interventions in high school. We just have to accept that they're not going to do better. It's really frustrating. How can we acknowledge the brain basis, but clearly articulate the importance of targeting good intervention with real expectations for growth?
Wow. Well, actually, it's kind of a fascinating question. I'd actually I've never heard that articulated like that before. And maybe that's just a little bit of a bias on my end of thinking about, the very nature of it being brain-based is that, it's not it is cognitive, and that, we understand that there's a huge amount of brain plasticity. So that's actually a great question. I'm not sure if, maybe Vince would have a good answer to that, because I've not actually encountered that before. I do believe that, I think I've lost my face.
Oh no, I noticed that.
Hello. Yeah, this is exciting. It's like that Chevy Chase movie. So I think, I do think, I actually think that's a challenging question, because one of the huge needs we have in preparing educators for the classroom is really helping them understand better education neuroscience. That, there's a huge value in understanding how the brain works, because literally the work that teachers are doing every day in the classroom is changing the brain. And so having that mindset that all the work we do changes the brain, literally is really, really critical for teachers to understand. And so, it's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer for you this morning.
No, I think it's very complicated, and I think as we keep going, I have a feeling that all the talks will integrate to help address some of that question, and how to better educate districts and how to be the advocate. So I will, on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Powers.